Nearly every resident of Whittier, Alaska, all 200 and some of them, lives inside a single 14-story concrete building. Their grocery store is in there, their post office, police station, church, and mayor's office, all inside. The building is named after a congressman whose body was never found. The only road in runs through a one-lane tunnel blasted through a mountain, and it didn't open until 2000. Before that, you took a train or a boat, or you didn't come at all. This town was never supposed to be a town. It was designed to be a military secret. And the reason it was a secret is the reason it still exists. In 1941, months before Pearl Harbor changed everything, a general named Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr. was running Alaska's Defense Command and staring at a map that terrified him. Japan had been growing more aggressive across the Pacific, island by island, base by base. Alaska, vast, exposed, practically undefended, was the most vulnerable territory America owned. Its coastline stretched for thousands of miles, with almost nothing guarding it. If the Japanese decided to push toward the North American mainland, Alaska was the open door, and Buckner didn't have nearly enough troops, supplies, or infrastructure to close it. What he needed, urgently, was a supply port, a place where ships could dock, unload cargo and troops, and feed them inland to the bases being hastily built near Anchorage and Fairbanks. But the port couldn't be just anywhere. Buckner had 3 non-negotiable requirements. First, deep water that wouldn't freeze in winter, which immediately eliminated most of Alaska's enormous coastline. Second, a location naturally hidden from aerial surveillance, because the threat of Japanese reconnaissance flights and bombing runs was not abstract, it was expected. And third, terrain where enemy radar would scatter uselessly off mountain walls instead of finding targets. His scouts searched the coastline and found exactly one place that met every requirement: a narrow strip of gravel shoreline at the head of Passage Canal, a finger of water extending inland from Prince William Sound. The Chugach Mountains rose steeply on 3 sides, forming a natural fortress of rock and ice. Aircraft approaching from almost any direction would have to fly directly into mountain walls before they could get a visual on the site. The water in the canal stayed ice-free 12 months a year, practically miraculous for Alaska. And the weather, which anywhere else would have been a devastating liability, was here the greatest asset of all. Cloud cover smothered the site roughly 300 days a year. Thick, low, impenetrable clouds that clung to the mountains like a permanent lid. You couldn't photograph the place from above. You could barely see it from a ship in the canal. From a military standpoint, this forgotten strip of gravel between mountains and ocean was nearly invisible to any enemy that came looking for it. They designated it Camp Sullivan and gave the operation a classified code, H-12. No civilians were permitted to enter. Photography was strictly banned. And the Army began work on the most critical piece of the project, a railroad tunnel that would bore 2.5 miles straight through Maynard Mountain, connecting the hidden port to the Alaska Railroad line, and from there to Anchorage, 60 miles northwest, and Fairbanks, hundreds of miles beyond. This tunnel would be the only land route in or out. Everything about Whittier would pass through that hole in the rock: soldiers, supplies, equipment, and secrets. Construction started in August 1941. The work was brutal, even by wartime standards. Men drilled and blasted through solid rock in sub-zero temperatures, inside a mountain, through an Alaskan winter so dark that daylight sometimes lasted only 5 or 6 hours. Avalanche risk was constant. The cold cracked equipment. Workers lived in temporary camps that offered little protection from wind and snow. But the urgency was real. After Pearl Harbor in December, and especially after the Japanese attacked the Aleutian Islands in June 1942, the need for a secure supply line into Alaska became desperate. On November 20th, 1942, the drilling crews broke through to the other side of Maynard Mountain. The Army awarded the construction company, West Construction, its highest civilian honor, the Army-Navy Production Award, for finishing 6 months ahead of schedule. By June 1, 1943, the tunnel was complete and the first train rolled through. 1 week later, the first troop ship docked at Whittier's Pier, and soldiers disappeared into the mountain, heading north toward bases most Americans didn't know existed. The Alaska Railroad would later estimate that the Whittier cutoff allowed them to carry roughly 75% more freight than the older route through Seward. At the height of operations, over 1,200 military personnel were stationed at Camp Sullivan. The buildings were mostly wood, barracks, mess halls, a chapel, a small theater. The whole settlement was built for function and speed, not permanence. Photographs of the railroad were classified as secret. The town's very existence was a secret. For the duration of the war, Whittier was one of the most important logistics hubs in the Northern Pacific, and virtually nobody in the American public knew it was there. The town's name, when it eventually got one, came not from any general or battle, but from a glacier. The Whittier Glacier, visible from Passage Canal, had been named back in 1915 after John Greenleaf Whittier, a 19th-century Quaker poet from Massachusetts who wrote verse about snowfall and abolition and rural New England. The most secretive military installation in Alaska wound up named after a pacifist poet who'd never traveled west of the Mississippi. There's no evidence anyone involved in the naming noticed the irony or cared. After Japan surrendered in 1945, it seemed like Whittier's purpose had expired. The wooden buildings weren't built to last. The wartime urgency was over. Camp Sullivan should have been dismantled and forgotten, another classified footnote in a classified war. But then the temperature between Washington and Moscow dropped, and the Cold War opened like a crack in the ice, and suddenly the generals needed Whittier again. The Soviet Union was the new enemy, and Alaska, sitting closer to Russia than to the lower 48, was once again the most exposed territory America had. The ice-free port, the cloud cover, the mountain tunnel, the same qualities that had hidden Whittier from Japan could hide it from the Soviets. But this time, the military didn't want temporary wooden barracks. They wanted something permanent, something bomb-proof, something that could house 1,000 people for months at a time without anyone needing to step outside, because Whittier's weather was so extreme that outdoor activity in winter wasn't just uncomfortable, it was genuinely dangerous. The numbers still seem fictional. Winds regularly screamed past 100 miles per hour. Gusts occasionally reached 150. Average annual snowfall was about 20 feet, 240 inches, piling up from October through May. Total annual precipitation, rain and snow combined, hovered near 200 inches. 16 feet of water falling from the sky every year, more than many tropical rainforests. The town averaged around 130 sunny days a year, which meant that for more than 2/3 of the calendar, Whittier lived under cloud, rain, snow, fog, or wind, and often several of those at once. On the worst days, the wind alone could knock a grown man off his feet. The Army Corps of Engineers responded with plans for something extraordinary, a complex of at least 10 massive, multi-story towers, all interconnected, all built from reinforced concrete, all designed to withstand Soviet ordnance and 8 months of winter. The soldiers and their families would live, eat, work, worship, and recreate entirely indoors. No one would need to go outside for months. The complex would be a self-contained world, a city under one roof. The scale of the plan rivaled anything the Corps had built since the Pentagon itself. They built 2 of the 10. Whether budget cuts, shifting strategy, or practical limitations killed the rest of the project depends on which account you read. But those 2 buildings were more than enough to change the landscape of Alaska. The first was the Buckner Building, completed in 1953, named after General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr., the man who'd first identified the site in 1941 and who became the highest-ranking American officer killed in the Pacific Theater when he died during the Battle of Okinawa in June 1945. It was staggering in scale. 6 visible floors above ground, 8 levels total counting the basement, and a penthouse for ventilation equipment. Approximately 275,000 square feet, roughly 500 feet long and between 50 and 150 feet wide. Cast from reinforced concrete poured directly onto slate bedrock, the building was designed to absorb whatever the Soviets, or the weather, could throw at it. The elevator shafts and stairwells doubled as structural reinforcement. Inside, it was a small city. Sleeping quarters for 1,000 soldiers, a massive cafeteria, a 320-seat movie theater, a 4-lane bowling alley, a barber shop, a bakery, a library, a radio station, a rifle range, a photo laboratory, a commissary, an officer's lounge, a small hospital, and a 6-cell jail. Underground tunnels connected it to the rest of the base. A soldier could live inside the Buckner Building for weeks without stepping outdoors. That was the entire purpose. For years, it was one of the largest buildings in Alaska, and people called it exactly what it was, the city under one roof. The second structure was different. Where the Buckner Building spread out, the Hodge Building went up. Completed in 1957 and named after Colonel William Walter Hodge, commander of the 93rd Engineer Regiment on the Alaska-Canada Highway, it rose 14 stories into the Alaskan sky. It was actually 3 separate towers built within inches of each other and connected by metal plates, forming what looked from a distance like a single monolithic slab of concrete. A 1956 article in the Fairbanks Daily News Miner marveled that the building might have been lifted out of New York City and dropped into the Alaskan wilderness intact. The paper noted that the Hodge and the Buckner together were the largest and most modern inhabited structures the Army Corps of Engineers had built since the Pentagon. Think about that for a moment. The Pentagon, and then these 2 buildings in a secret town behind a mountain in Alaska. That was the comparison the press was making. The Hodge Building was designed for families. 152 and 3-bedroom apartments, plus bachelor efficiency units, with a total capacity of about 1,000 people. And here's a detail that matters later. The Whittier School was connected at the base of the West Tower by an underground tunnel, so children could walk from their apartment to their classroom in short sleeves on the coldest, darkest, most wind-blasted days of winter without ever setting foot outside. At its peak, this remote outpost, reachable only by train or ship, invisible from the air, drenched in rain, had the population and self-sufficiency of a small American town. Imagine what it must have felt like to arrive. You're a young Army wife in 1957, coming to join your husband. You've traveled from the lower 48, maybe Kansas, maybe Georgia, maybe California, and now you're sitting on a train as it enters a pitch-black tunnel through a mountain. 2.5 miles of darkness. When you emerge on the other side, you see water, mountains, clouds, and 2 enormous concrete buildings rising from a strip of gravel that looks nothing like any place you've ever lived. Your apartment is on the 9th floor of a 14-story tower. Your child's school is underground. The nearest civilian town is 60 miles away by train through the same tunnel you just came through. You might not see the sun for weeks. Nobody chose to live here. Every family, every soldier, every child walking through that tunnel to school had been assigned by the United States Army. Then the missiles changed everything. By the late 1950s, intercontinental ballistic missiles were transforming the geometry of the Cold War. A supply port in southern Alaska suddenly mattered less than it had 5 years earlier. The Army had planned 10 more towers. They would never be built. In 1960, the military decommissioned the base. The port of Whittier was transferred to civilian control. The soldiers and their families packed their belongings and left. Within months, the population dropped from over 1,000 to nearly nothing. The Buckner Building was placed in inactive status, though its power plant kept running until 1966. The Hodge Building emptied floor by floor, but not completely. When the Army left, roughly 30 civilians stayed. Some had been working the port or the railroad. Some were fishermen who knew the waters of Prince William Sound and didn't want to leave them. Some had reasons no one recorded. 30 people, 2 massive concrete buildings, each designed for 1,000, a tunnel through a mountain, and weather that could kill you between your front door and your car. The 10 unbuilt towers would have made Whittier a real city. Instead, it was 30 people rattling around inside the Cold War's most overbuilt housing project. They were still figuring out what came next when the earth cracked apart beneath them. On March 27, 1964, Good Friday, at 5:36 in the evening, the most powerful earthquake ever recorded in North America struck Prince William Sound. Magnitude 9.2 on the moment magnitude scale. The second most powerful earthquake measured anywhere on Earth since modern instruments existed. The ground shook for nearly 5 minutes. In Anchorage, 60 miles away, roads heaved and fell like ocean swells. Buildings collapsed. People thought the Soviets had detonated a nuclear weapon. The earthquake's epicenter was approximately 33 miles from Whittier. But the shaking, as terrible as it was, wasn't the worst of what hit Whittier. The seismic violence triggered enormous underwater landslides along the floor of Passage Canal, huge sections of the seafloor slumping and sliding. And those landslides generated waves, not distant ocean tsunamis that take hours to arrive and give coastal cities time to evacuate. Local waves, waves born from landslides happening right there, right offshore, hundreds of yards from people's homes. 3 tsunamis struck Whittier in rapid, devastating succession, roughly 90 seconds apart. The earth hadn't even stopped shaking when the first wave hit. There was no siren, no warning system that could have helped, no higher ground you could reach in 90 seconds from the waterfront. The water simply rose and it came while the ground was still moving beneath your feet. One of those waves reached an estimated height of over 100 feet. A wall of ocean, taller than the first 7 stories of the Hodge Building. It hit the waterfront at full force, and one of the places it struck was a lumber mill on the shore. Inside that mill, 12 people had gathered that evening to celebrate a birthday. 6 of them were children. The wave obliterated the building. The wave obliterated the bodies. They were never recovered. 13 people died in Whittier that evening. The town's total population at the time was approximately 70. That means the earthquake and tsunami killed close to 1 in 5 residents. Proportionally, one of the most devastating single-event losses any community in American history has ever absorbed. The waterfront was destroyed. 2 sawmills gone. The Union Oil Company tank farm smashed and burning. The Alaska Railroad Depot wrecked. The Army Pier's handling towers ripped from their foundations. The small boat harbor ruined. Frame dwellings swept away. The tsunami's surge drove a 2 by 12-inch plank through the rubber tire of a truck, a detail preserved in U.S. Geological Survey photographs that tells you everything about the force of the water without requiring a single additional word. Total damage exceeded $10 million, a devastating figure for a settlement that wouldn't have existed at all without the military. And the 2 Cold War buildings? The Buckner Building, anchored to bedrock and oriented at an oblique angle to the seismic motion, sustained no structural damage. None. Engineers inspected it afterward and certified it sound. The Hodge Building, built to the same concrete and bedrock standard, held firm. The buildings designed to survive Soviet bombs had survived something no bomb could replicate. A 9.2 earthquake 33 miles from the epicenter, followed by a 100-foot wall of water. Everything wooden, everything built on fill or soft sediment, was wrecked. The concrete stood. The survivors gathered inside the Hodge Building. There was nowhere else. The waterfront, which had been the reason the military built the town in the first place, was a field of wreckage. The wooden homes were gone. The infrastructure was gone. What remained was concrete, the two massive Cold War fortresses standing in the debris like they'd barely noticed the apocalypse around them. The land itself had subsided over 5 feet, putting some developed areas underwater at high tide. Whittier had been reduced in the space of a few minutes to its most elemental components: 2 buildings and the people inside them. The military fully withdrew its last operations by 1966. The population of Whittier could have gone to 0 then. Every practical argument said it should have. The waterfront was destroyed. The military jobs were gone. 1 building was abandoned. There was still no road. The only way in was by train through the tunnel or by boat in summer. The weather hadn't changed, and it wasn't going to. 1/5 of the population was dead. But the people who remained, roughly 140 by the end of the decade, did something no planner would have predicted. On July 15, 1969, they incorporated Whittier as a city. A municipality of 140 people, trapped behind a mountain, living inside a building the Army no longer wanted, formed a government. They elected officials. They built a small boat harbor. They started planning. And they kept living in the Hodge Building, which they gradually converted into condominiums. In 1972, they gave it a new name, and the name came from one of the strangest disappearances in American political history. On the morning of October 16, 1972, Alaska Congressman Nick Begich boarded a twin-engine Cessna 310 at Anchorage International Airport, bound for a campaign fundraiser in Juneau, 570 miles to the southeast. With him was House Majority Leader Hale Boggs of Louisiana, the second most powerful Democrat in the United States, a man who'd served 14 terms in Congress, along with Begich's aide Russell Brown and pilot Don Jones. Boggs had flown up from Louisiana to barnstorm the state with the freshman Alaska congressman as a political favor. The plane lifted off and made a routine radio check with the tower at 9:09 a.m., and then it flew into low clouds over the mountains. No distress call, no signal, nothing. What followed was, at that time, the largest search and rescue operation in American history. 40 military aircraft, 50 civilian planes, a search grid spanning 325,000 square miles, larger than the state of Texas. More than 3,600 hours of flight time over 39 days. They searched forests and glaciers and mountain passes and coastline and open water. They found nothing. Not a wing, not a wheel strut, not a seat cushion, not a scrap of fabric. 4 men and a Cessna 310 had vanished into the Alaskan wilderness as absolutely and completely as if they had never existed. Begich was 40 years old. Conspiracy theories erupted almost immediately. Boggs had publicly attacked FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, had dissented from the Warren Commission's findings on the Kennedy assassination, and had sparred with the Nixon White House. Some people whispered about sabotage, but no evidence of foul play was ever found, because no evidence of anything was ever found. Both congressmen were declared dead in absentia in late December 1972. And here's the detail that borders on surreal. The November elections had taken place while the search was still ongoing. Both men were on the ballot. Both won. Nick Begich was re-elected to Congress posthumously, or at least while officially missing and presumed dead. A special election the following year replaced him with a Republican named Don Young, who would go on to hold the seat for the next 49 years, until his own death in 2022. In 1973, the people of Whittier renamed the Hodge Building. They called it Begich Towers Condominium, in memory of the congressman whose plane had disappeared somewhere in the mountains and wilderness that surrounded their town. A man who vanished became the namesake of a place that refused to. The following year, the Begich Towers Condominium Association of Apartment Owners took over management of the building. The 196 apartments belonged to the residents. They owned their homes, they ran their building, and they ran their city. The post office moved into the East Wing. The police department set up on the ground floor. A small Methodist church held services on Sundays. A tiny grocery store called the Cozy Corner opened, and against all odds stayed open. A health clinic, a laundromat, a bed and breakfast on the upper floors, a conference room, a playground for the children. Everything a town needs stacked floor by floor inside reinforced Cold War concrete, connected to the school by a tunnel underground. And outside, just uphill, the Buckner Building, the original city under one roof, the pride of Alaska, the one the newspaper had compared to the Pentagon, started to rot. Nobody ever found the money or the will to save it. The asbestos saturating the structure, in the insulation, the floor tiles, the ceiling panels, made any renovation project staggeringly expensive. Millions of dollars just for the abatement before you'd fixed a single window or replaced a single pipe. Private owners cycled through over the years, each with plans that came to nothing. One reportedly wanted to convert it into a state prison, which, given that it was a bomb-proof fortress behind a mountain accessible only by tunnel, was arguably the most logical idea anyone proposed for the place. It went nowhere. A Hollywood studio once scouted it as a filming location for a submarine thriller, imagining the Buckner Building as a Russian naval base. There's an irony there. A building constructed during the Cold War to defend against the Soviets, nearly cast as a Soviet facility in a movie. That went nowhere either. Decade by decade, the building consumed itself. Water pooled inches deep across entire floors. Mold colonized the walls in black and green patterns that looked almost deliberate, like some grim art installation. Windows shattered and were never replaced, and rain and snow blew freely through the corridors. Bears wandered in through ground-level openings and explored hallways that had once held soldiers watching movies and rolling strikes on the bowling lanes and sitting in the theater and eating in the cafeteria. Vandals stripped whatever could be carried out. The 275,000-square-foot structure that had been the largest building in Alaska, the one the Fairbanks newspaper had compared to the Pentagon, became something between a ruin and a monument, too expensive to fix, too massive to tear down, too contaminated to ignore, and too visible to forget. Every resident of Begich Towers could see it from their window. When residents were asked if the decaying hulk bothered them, most said no. It was part of their history. They were used to looking at it. It just sat there, decomposing in the rain, a 250,000-square-foot lesson in what happens to even the strongest building when nobody lives inside it. Inside Begich Towers, though, life settled into something that felt completely normal to the people living it and deeply alien to everyone who heard about it. The hallways were cinder block and linoleum. The wind howled against the concrete on bad nights, which was most nights. A woman named Brenda Tolman, who moved to Whittier from California in 1982 and became one of the building's longest-tenured residents, once joked that the hallways could feel like a mental institution. She said this with affection. She also called Whittier God's little acre. She served as the town's notary public, kept an artist's studio in the building, and made no apology for living there. "We certainly don't all love each other here," she said, "but we help each other, and we bond because of whatever it is that attracts you here." A teacher named Erica Thompson, who taught at the school connected to the building by the underground tunnel, put it more simply. "For me, it's just home. For the most part, you know everybody. It's a community under one roof. We have everything we need." What they didn't have, for decades, was a road. Until the year 2000, there was no way to drive to Whittier. You could ride the Alaska Railroad through the tunnel, departing from the Portage Station about 11 miles away. You could come by boat in summer. You could fly in on a small plane to a 1,480-foot gravel runway that wasn't maintained in winter. That was it. There was no road because there had never been a road. The tunnel had been built exclusively for trains in 1943, and nobody had ever converted it. Every night, when the last train passed through, the tunnel closed and Whittier was sealed off from the rest of the world until morning. Every shipment of groceries, every piece of mail, every new resident, every medical emergency that couldn't be handled by the clinic, All of it had to go through the tunnel on the railroad schedule, or it waited. The isolation was real, and it shaped everything. There was no resident dentist in Whittier. A dental chair sat in a converted apartment unit, used only when a visiting practitioner came through on rotation. Major grocery runs meant a train trip to Anchorage and back, hauling bags through the tunnel. Medical emergencies that exceeded the clinic's capacity had to wait for transport. In winter, when the harbor iced over and the small planes couldn't land on the unplowed gravel strip, the train through the tunnel was the only connection to anything. The schedule dictated when you could leave and when you could come back. Miss the last train, and you weren't going anywhere. But the people who stayed didn't experience it the way outsiders imagined. They fished for salmon and halibut in the Sound. They watched glaciers calve into the water from their windows. They held town meetings in the building's conference room. They argued about the same things small towns everywhere argue about: budgets, maintenance, who should serve on the condo board, who left a mess in the laundry room. Everyone knew everyone's business, which was both the comfort and the cost of living in a single building. In winter, when the seasonal population drained away and the permanent residents had the tower to themselves, Whittier became one of the most private places in America. Not because anyone enforced privacy, but because the mountain and the weather enforced it for them. You could go days without seeing anyone who didn't live in your building. You could go weeks without seeing a stranger's face. On June 7, 2000, after 21 months of construction and an investment of tens of millions of dollars, the Anton Anderson Memorial Tunnel opened to vehicle traffic. Named after the Army engineer who'd overseen the original 1943 railroad bore, the tunnel was converted from a single-purpose rail passage into something unprecedented in North America: a one-lane, dual-use highway and railroad tunnel, 2.5 miles long, shared by cars and trains on an alternating schedule. The railroad tracks were embedded flush into a concrete roadway, so vehicles could drive directly over them. Cars heading to Whittier left on the half-hour. Cars leaving left on the hour. Trains took priority, and when a train was in the tunnel, everyone waited. Jet turbine fans at each portal pushed fresh air through the bore between convoys. The first tunnel in North America designed for temperatures of -40 and winds of 150 miles per hour. Safe houses were built into the tunnel walls in case of emergency. 60 closed-circuit cameras monitored every foot. Driving through it felt almost ceremonial. You arrived at a staging area, sometimes 15 or 20 minutes early, parked in a line of cars at the base of the mountain, and waited. When the light turned green, you proceeded in single file through 2.5 miles of rock. The tunnel is narrow, damp, dimly lit. The walls are close. The ceiling is low. It takes about 10 minutes to drive through, and when you emerge on the other side, blinking, you see Passage Canal spread out before you, mountains rising on every side, and the concrete slab of Begich Towers standing at the water's edge like a monolith from another century. Which it essentially is. State planners had predicted the road would bring 650,000 annual visitors to Whittier. They were optimistic too early. The first year brought closer to 150,000, and the toll, $15 per car, was blamed. They lowered prices. The tourists came. Today, Whittier receives over 700,000 visitors in a typical summer season. Cruise ships, full-sized Princess and Norwegian vessels, dock at the deepwater port. Glacier tour boats head into the Sound, passing tidewater glaciers and humpback whales. Kayakers launch from the small boat harbor. Charter fishing operations fill up weeks in advance. For a few months each year, a town of roughly 250 permanent residents becomes one of the most trafficked tourist waypoints in south-central Alaska. The summer population swells past 1,000. Seasonal workers fill vacant apartments in the tower. Day trippers from Anchorage drive through the mountain, spend a few hours looking at glaciers and bears and the weird concrete tower where an entire town lives, and drive back before the tunnel closes. The contrast between summer and winter Whittier is almost violent. On a July afternoon, the small boat harbor is packed. Tour buses idle in parking lots. Tourists in rain jackets photograph the building where the whole town lives. Then photograph the abandoned building on the hill. Then buy coffee from a kiosk near the pier and get back on the bus. The cruise ship passengers, thousands of them, disembark, stretch their legs, take glacier tours, and reboard before evening. For a few hours, Whittier has the energy of a place 10 times its size. And then the ships pull away, and the buses leave, and the last tunnel opening passes, and the town goes quiet. By September, the cruise ships are gone. The tour operators pack up, the seasonal workers empty their apartments and leave. And Whittier contracts back into itself. 200 and some people, one building, the harbor, the rain, and the ruin on the hillside. The tunnel still closes at 10:30 p.m. After that, the mountain stands between Whittier and the rest of the world, just as it has since 1943. Some residents say the winter months are their favorite. The town finally belongs to them again. The children still walk to school through the underground tunnel, the same one the Army built in 1957 for soldiers' kids. On a January morning, when wind is tearing across Passage Canal at 80 miles per hour, and snow is falling sideways and the temperature has dropped to something that hurts to breathe, a child in Whittier rides the elevator down, crosses through the heated tunnel, and arrives at school in short sleeves. They have never been outside. On the worst days, they might not see the sky at all. This system has worked for nearly 70 years. The tunnel doesn't know or care that the Army left. It just connects. Whittier resists the kind of ending that documentary stories are supposed to have. It isn't a cautionary tale. Nobody ignored a warning or made a foolish bet. It isn't a decline narrative. The town has more people now than it did in 1969 when it incorporated. It isn't a ghost story. People live here, raise children, hold elections, run a government. And it isn't really a comeback, because Whittier never tried to become something else. It just kept being what it is, a concrete building full of people who chose to stay in a place the military built, the earthquake tested, the weather punishes every single day, and the mountain hides from the rest of the world. The building is named after a man who vanished into the sky and was never found. The town is named after a poet who never saw it. The tunnel that connects it to the rest of the continent was blasted through rock in secret during a war most Americans didn't know was being fought on their own soil. The other building, the one that was supposed to be the real city, the grand one, the largest in Alaska, sits windowless on the hillside, filling slowly with water and mold and silence, visited only by bears and the wind. Every night when the last tunnel opening passes and the mountain closes around Whittier like a fist, the lights in Begich Towers burn against the dark. 200 people, one building, and the long way home through the rock.